Hi everyone, my name is Matthew Griffin. I'm the CEO and founder of the 311 Institute, a global futures and deep futures advisory organization that looks up to 50 years out. We look at hundreds of emerging technologies, hundreds of trends and mega trends, and we try to understand what all of these mean for all of us on this planet. Now, in this particular presentation, which I actually delivered last week in Kuala Lumpur, I'm going to be talking through the future of food. Now, for those of you that were at the event and have been asking me to put this presentation together because it wasn't recorded, welcome back. And for those of you that are first-time viewers of this presentation, hello. Now, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be showing you the future of food. Now, I'm going to be taking you through a variety of different themes, trends, technologies, and all kinds of different things. So we're going to start here. When we have a look at the current agricultural food production system, is it working okay? Now, if it's working okay, why do we have 890 million people who are undernourished? Or is it breaking as we look into the future, with things getting worse, more unsustainable, and so on and so forth? Or is it already broken? So you can make up your own mind on these, but I'm going to be walking you through quite a number of different stats and statistics and trends, and you can decide for yourself. Depending on what you then think, whether it's fine, breaking, or broken, I'm going to show you how we solve some of the problems that I think that we actually face using conventional thinking. I'm then going to walk through what unconventional thinking does for us. And then I'm going to show you some of the startups that are doing some amazing things in the food production space across the board. And I'm going to show you the difficulty that some of these organizations are having when it comes to growing and scaling. Simply because a lot of the incumbents, whether those are actually the existing sort of institutions or whether it's actually existing incumbents, don't really know whether they want to partner with these organizations, buy these organizations, or just plain put them out of business. That's it. And frankly, globally, it's pretty much all three. It just varies on the geography that you're actually in. Now, skipping ahead there. Now, ask yourself this question. What if we could solve global hunger and feed everybody sustainably and affordably? So pause on this a minute. What if we had in our hands today the technologies and the ability to solve global hunger? Forever. Arguably, big statement, but what if? And what if, while we are solving some of the problems that we see across the world today and tomorrow, what if we could actually heal and or regenerate the planet? The planet that we all rely on. And as we continue to see eco-diversity and biodiversity systems struggling and straining, where even in the farming community, we're talking about the end of pollinators and what that means basically for crop production and fruit production and so on and so forth. So what would happen if we could correct some of the things basically that are going wrong with today's food production system, to put it kindly, and heal the planet? Now, as we start having a look at the future, basically, there's a huge amount that we really need to consider and look at. This world is this future is this kind of vast landscape. We've got all these little landmarks, but we don't really know where all these different landmarks actually go on the map that is the future. So when we have a look at trends, for example, there are hundreds of mega trends that are impacting us all directly and indirectly. When we have a look at the technologies that we are using to solve problems, create new products and services, there are hundreds of different emerging technologies where artificial intelligence, blockchain, 3D printing, 3D bioprinting, and everything else, basically virtual reality, etc., is just one. Now, in order to try to show you some of the things that are actually coming through, some of the things that are actually affecting us, I can either just sort of show you the tip of the iceberg, but rather than do that, I created this video. So these codexes are free for you to download. They're about 1 inch thick each if you print them out. You can get them from 311institute.com/insights, and you can mooch through these codexes at your leisure. But For those of you that don't have time to mooch through the codexes, how's your pause game? Because I put them all into this following video. It's about 2 minutes. Enjoy the show. So as I say, there are hundreds of trends that are impacting you directly and indirectly, as well as the future of food. And there are hundreds of emerging technologies that the only thing they're doing is changing everything about everything. Now, when we have a look at the future of food, ask yourself this question. Is it broken already, or is it breaking? At the end of this little chapter, make up your own mind. Let me know in the comments. Now, when we have a look at our uneven world, 50% of the income of particular people in particular countries like Africa, Asia, parts of Latin America is actually spent on energy and food. So imagine spending 50% of your entire wage on energy and food, essentially just keeping warm or keeping cool, depending on the country that you're in, and just staying fed. Yeah, when we have a look at different regions of the world, again, Africa, Latin America, different parts of Asia, India, for example, yeah, most people spend 65% of their time gathering and growing food. Now, if you spent 65% of your day growing and gathering food, how much time is left for education, another job, whatever it happens to be? So the ability to reduce the amount of time that people spend growing and gathering food actually means that we can have an educational impact, which then helps lift people out of poverty and hardship and all these other sorts of things. We have, the figure is now 890, but we actually have over 830 million people, according to the latest United Nations polls, that are undernourished. And when we actually have a look at people in extreme hunger, yeah, that's still in the hundreds of millions. Putting this into perspective, that's almost about 1/10 of the world's population. That's a lot. 1 in 10 people. We have, on top of that, food inflation. In the UK, food inflation is running generally at 20 to 30%. I was in Ghana a little while ago. It's running at 60% there. Food inflation is a major problem for all of us, but again, those people in developing countries. Supply chain disruption. If we have a look at the war in Ukraine, let's talk about that. We see limits on grain shipments. We see sunflower and what we call raw seeds basically being constrained. So seeds, basically we need the seeds to plant in the fields to grow new crops. And actually a lot of those, what we call sort of raw seeds, are actually being hoarded by a variety of different individuals, shall we say. On top of that, we have the informal economy. So as we have a look at the future of food, we also have to remember that almost 1 billion people who generally exist on about $1.50 a day, depending on the countries, actually rely on food production for their primary source of income. So if we change how we produce food, there is an impact to these people on their jobs, their livelihoods, and so on and so forth. So we have to actually think, how do we actually help them as we start transitioning from one food production system to another? Now, from an agricultural footprint perspective, 20% of all global greenhouse gases are generated and produced by agriculture, whether it is farting cows, basically whether it is the breakdown of crops which produce methane, and so on and so on and so forth. When we have a look at the freshwater consumption or the freshwater footprint of agriculture, 70% of all of the accessible fresh water on the planet is now being consumed by agriculture. 30% is being used by humanity. Now, here's kind of a rub. As we have more people, we need more food. So we need more to grow more crops, which use up more water. We also need more protein, so we need to grow and produce more cattle. More cattle need water, for example. Chickens need water, for example. But they also need more crops. So as we start looking at a population that by 2030 will be around 8.5 billion people, do we humans have more water at our fingertips, or do we have less? Now, bearing in mind that by 2030, overall, we're going to need 35% more food, 40% more water, and admittedly 50% more energy, how do we sustain today's food production systems when what we're already producing, even though we're producing enough, there's a huge amount of food waste, let's not forget, still leaves almost 1 billion people undernourished, and still leaves the rest of us actually sort of wanting more, along with all sorts of other problems. Now, by 2030, we'll have 8.6 billion people on the planet. In Asia especially, we have a growing middle class. Now, this means that we'll have 600 million more middle class people in Asia, particularly India and China, by 2030. Now, as people become richer, they need and they want more protein. So China, for example, has actually been doing deals around the world actually in cultivated meat. A little while ago, they did a couple of deals in Israel, basically for $300 million to try to secure protein in advance, because a growing middle class wants more protein, needs more protein, and so on and so forth. That's it. So how do you kind of solve that conundrum? Now, against all of this, so we need more food, we need more crops, we need more cattle, more livestock. However, when we have a look at extreme weather since the year 2000, the latest insurance statistics tell us that insurance companies like Aviva and so on and so forth, have paid out over $2.97 trillion in extreme weather-related damage. 4.2 billion people are affected by extreme weather, whether it's floods, droughts, fires, whatever it happens to be, and there's been a 75% increase in major disasters. So as we start looking forwards basically to a world that is increasingly dominated by whether it's global warming, anthropogenic warming, depending on what you believe and what you think, but generally climate change, we don't just need to produce a little bit more food. We need to produce significantly more food. When we have a look at ocean acidification, since the year 2000, we've seen a 30% increase in ocean acidification. Now, that affects 75% of all sea life. Now, you might not necessarily care about ocean acidification, but baby fish have skeletons. Those skeletons are made up of calcium and so on and so forth. Now, the higher the pH of the oceans, the bigger a problem it is for those fish to actually grow. Another problem that we actually have that has been identified is as ocean acidification increases, fish are actually having problems avoiding predators because they start having different biological imbalances that sort of puts them off their game. So we've got extreme overfishing as well in many countries. So what we have is a future that is potentially dominated by increasingly affected fish stocks or marine stocks and overfishing, depending on the countries that you're actually in. We have water scarcity. By 2030, the United Nations estimates that 129 countries basically will be in extreme water stress. Now, extreme water stress is characterized as you cannot grow crops in your country or in regions of your country. California are already experiencing this. 95% of the state, up until kind of recently, was in drought. And a lot of the farmers are now starting to actually have, shall we say, rather angry conversations basically with the water authorities on who gets water basically from the Colorado River. Now, is it the people? The urban centres? Is it the people who want to use swimming pools and everything else? Or is it the farming communities? And of course, everyone wants water, because without water, there is no civilization. We see desertification on the rise, 23 hectares per minute. We see land degradation. So as the land itself, as the soil itself degrades, we have problems growing crops. So then we need additional fertilizers. Now, when we have a look at things like price inflation, did you know basically that the cost of fertilizer has increased by threefold since the beginning of the Ukraine war? And of course, all of this leads to what the United Nations are increasingly calling water wars. So do you want to be fighting over water basically in 2030? Because increasingly, we're already seeing a rise in conflicts around the world. It's a different topic. Go and explore it. Now, when we start having a look at the impact of these different trends and things, basically on food production itself, 20% of global livestock is lost every year to infectious diseases. So things like bird flu, avian flu, swine flu, HN5/1, and this is actually an increasing trend as we start seeing epidemics on the rise. Now, when we have a look at both human and animal pandemics and epidemics, sort of focusing more on the epidemic side, experts have been looking at the intensity and frequency of epidemics around the world, and they estimate that over the next number of decades, the number of epidemics that we will all be subjected to will triple. Now, up to 40% of global crop production is lost to diseases and pests. Now, as we see global warming, climate change, etc., depending on the region that you're living in, this will increase. But then also 10% of global food production is lost to extreme climate events. Now that's droughts, that's fires, that's floods, that's storms. We've seen that throughout Europe. Last year, we saw temperatures in excess of 40 degrees Celsius really across most of Europe, which left Europe in drought conditions. Even this year, most rivers in Europe are only getting 10% of the water they need to actually keep themselves at the right levels. So, is this sustainable? Now, when we have a look at conventional thinking and how we use conventional thinking to solve some of the problems that we see from climate change, increased epidemics and pests and all sorts of different things, this is sort of generally what we're talking about. Precision agriculture, doing more with less, using a mixture of artificial intelligence, robotics, machine vision, satellites, hyperspectral sensors, and so on and so forth, basically to do more with less. Bearing in mind that current agricultural production methods also include lots of fertilizers, hormones, antibiotics, herbicides, and so on and so forth, which actually create their own problems, generally in a lot of the ocean tributaries, but again, that's a slightly different topic. But we think precision agriculture, do more with less, grow more with less. In the UK, basically, we have experiments around the world's first fully autonomous farms. And in fact, up north, we've actually managed to create the first fully autonomous farm where we used robots and machinery and artificial intelligence and machine vision to plant the seeds, to monitor the seeds, to weed them and tend to the seeds and the crops as they actually grew and then harvest them. So again, this is kind of taking precision agriculture sort of a step further. But it's still iterative, it's still traditional agriculture, just in a new, more modern technical shell. We think we can create better crops and better animals. When we have a look at technologies like CRISPR, which is essentially almost a real-time gene editing tool, but it's one of the most powerful tools on the planet. arguably more impactful in the long run than artificial intelligence for a variety of different reasons. Again, different topic. We think we can produce animals and crops with bigger yields. Did you know that if we use CRISPR gene editing technology to turn off the sunscreen within plants, you can increase the yield of plants by 30%? And all kinds of other weirdness. If we have genetically engineered bacteria that we put into the soil, then we can boost nitrogen uptake for plants, and so on and so on and so forth. We're also creating crops, typically tier 1 crops, basically that are disease resistant, drought resistant, and so on and so forth. And when we have a look at cows, we've even managed to use CRISPR gene editing technology to create cows that are resistant to TB. So on the one hand, we kind of think, well, what we have is we already have an existing sort of crop system and an existing livestock system. Let's just try to essentially supercharge those. And of course, if we need more animals in the future because we need more protein, then we need more crops, which leads to deforestation, disease, and monocultures. And did you actually know a little statistic that I learned while giving this presentation in Malaysia? In Malaysia, 8 million hectares of Malaysia is actually set aside to farming. But they import 10% of their crops. So how does that work? Well, about 6.5 million hectares is given over to palm oil production. 0.5 million hectares is given over to rubber production. And then animals and humans kind of then battle it out for that other million hectares. So when we have a look at countries like Singapore, Singapore have the 2030 plan, where by 2030 they want all of their food, or they want 30% of their food to be produced in the country. That's it. And we have a couple of ways that we can actually do that. So everywhere I travel around the world, every government, every institution is talking really quite vehemently and vociferously about the concept of food security, because during the pandemic and post-pandemic, how many times have you seen the shops in your supermarkets bare because we've run out of cucumbers or tomatoes or staples or whatever it happens to be? So food security is arguably now one of the government's top priorities, irrespective of where you are on the planet. When we have a look at burgers, did you know that one burger uses 6 kilograms on average of cattle feed, 41 square feet of land, and 58 gallons of water? Now, when I was in Malaysia, I asked the following question. How many burgers do you think they consume in the USA? Most people thought it was actually in the region of about 1 billion. It's 50 billion. Now, as I said, these are statistics basically that are coming from reputable organizations. If I'm honest, I'm not quite sure how a population of 360 million people consumes 50 billion burgers a year. But this is the stats. So go and dig into this. Tell me if this is actually real or not, because frankly, while I've put it into the presentation, I'd love to know basically if it is real, because the data and the research that I've used suggests that it is. And I just find that phenomenal. That's kind of like a crazy statistic. Now, when we have a look at the future of food, a little while ago I was doing some work with Samsung. We were having a look at the year 2069, and a lot of the other sort of future of food futurists that are out there, and you can go and Google them and everything else, were saying, well, in the future we all need to be eating insects because current crop production systems and current meat production systems basically just aren't sustainable, etc., etc., etc. Now, I don't know about you. I'm not a big insect eater. I know that some cultures basically, are very big insect eaters, and that's fine. Yeah, my personal preference is I'd rather actually chew a steak than a locust. We also then have plant-based alternatives. We see these from companies like Just and so on and so forth, and we've seen the uptake of plant-based burgers. But fundamentally, we still need to grow the crops to produce these. Yeah? And we still need the farmland to produce these and everything else. Now, when we have a look at kind of conventional thinking, people are also talking about using algae, seaweed, so for example, off California, as well as off the coasts of Japan, we're seeing huge seaweed farms rise up because seaweed's actually very good for you, good source basically of omega sort of 6 and so on and so forth. But it's also, and omega 3s, but it's also a good source of protein. So, we're sort of trying to think, what do we do here to sort of solve some of the problems that we have. Now, interestingly enough, when we have a look at trying to adopt new behaviors, the vast majority of governments around the world have stopped short of saying don't eat meat, because they feared that they would actually be voted out at the next general elections. Because if I came to you on my high horse and said, don't eat meat, you think, who are you to tell me not to eat meat? And so, however, if we sort of say to you, why not eat plants? Or we highly suggest that you eat plants, you might not end up actually voting me out of office. So ironically, basically, when we have a look at the messages that politicians are putting out, they're being very cautious, diplomatic, and actually they are kowtowing basically to the next general election. And when we have a look at sustainable food, I mean, what is the most sustainable food that we actually produce today in using current production methods? Can you think of a sustainable food? Let me know. Or what is the most sustainable food? Now, when we have a look at unconventional thinking, as a futurist, when I talk about emerging technologies, when one particular technology starts running out of steam, we talk about jumping the S-curve. So one technology starts running out of steam and a new technology supersedes it. It's very much the same in business. When one business model starts fading away, it is superseded by a new business model or a new way of doing things. So businesses also jump S-curves. But how would we actually jump the proverbial S-curve when it comes to agriculture? Well, firstly today, what if I could still feed you chicken nuggets, steak, duck, turkey, and so on and so forth, burgers, the stuff that you're already eating today, in the same format, etc., 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 same taste, without the hormones, without basically the antibiotics, without the travel miles, without the environmental footprint, and so on and so forth. What if I could provide you a steak, but it's just never ever been anywhere near an animal? You've never had to kill a cow or raise a cow. What if I could do the same with seafood? What if I could put a salmon fillet on your plate? An authentic salmon fillet on your plate. But we've never had to catch a fish or kill a fish. This sort of stuff sounds impossible, right? But you are already your own solution, because with your own body, your cells are dividing to create new muscle tissue, etc., etc., etc. It's exactly what animals do. The flesh that we eat from animals came originally from just one cell that kept dividing and dividing and dividing and dividing and dividing and so on and so forth. So what we've just managed to do is take that same process and do what happens inside of an animal, outside of an animal. But years ago, producing meat in this way would have cost about $3 to $4 million per pound. Now it's getting so cheap that it's rivaling supermarket prices, and if you're in the US and if you're in Singapore, you can buy meat that has been made essentially in a lab, if you really want to be crude about it, a factory, whatever we want to term it, however the marketing people want to put a wrapper around it. And this is how we do it.
We've all been there, right? In the grocery store. Oh, I'll just buy this meat. And there it is. And all we have to do is buy it. We don't have to think about what it took to make that chicken in that nice packaging. But the reality of the way that it came about, it's incredibly unsustainable. And that's one of the biggest problems facing humanity right now. But we figured out a way to solve it. The whole idea is that that chicken in itself has an unlimited source of itself and there is a way where you can take just a handful of cells and keep growing them essentially infinitely. For those very first cells, it was important to us how we got the cells, not just that we got the cells. We came up with the idea to use one feather from the single best chicken that we could find.
We picked out.
The first thing we need to do is we need to identify a cell that we are going to use as the basic starter material. And then what we need to do is find a food for it to grow in. So we have to identify the right set of nutrients that will cause the cells to multiply, but not just multiply, but do so quickly and into high densities.
Wake up, I wanna lift you up, I wanna dress you up, let's be friends.
It was an out-of-body experience to sit there and eat a chicken, but have the chicken that you're eating running around in front of you. You don't imagine doing something like that.
So, real meat without having to kill the real animal. Jumping the S-curve. Now, this brings us into some interesting questions and some interesting ethical issues. So I actually teach some of these subjects at different universities as well as different secondary schools around the world. Now, if we can take the cell from an animal and we can use that to create a burger, could we actually use that to create a panda burger? People are already using this technology to create tiger burgers, giraffe burgers, as well as traditional beef burgers. Now, when we start talking about this, ironically, just as a little bit of a sort of weird segue, would a panda burger made in this way be right, wrong, or culturally insensitive? If you were the company that actually decided to make a panda burger, would people in China suddenly boycott your brand? Now, let's face it, people aren't really going to make panda burgers, but this also leads into some interesting sort of segues, some interesting conversations and different debates. That's it, about, what we actually see as food, for example. Now, when we have a look at cellular agriculture, as this particular technology and this trend is called, we can already create coffee without the coffee bean. Starbucks imports over 500 million tons of coffee a year with all of the sustainability and environmental footprint that endows. We can make dairy in this way. We can make palm oil in this way. In fact, basically some of my clients, which are the world's largest palm oil purchasers, are now starting to look at lab-made palm oil, which then starts weaning them off the reliance of the big plantations that we actually see around the world. Now, when we have a look at soy production, we can produce soy without the soy plant. We can create whey in this way, and we can do much, much more. So by taking the cell from an animal or a plant, increasingly we are able to produce the products that we would normally extract from those animals or plants in a much more environmentally and sustainable way. Bearing in mind, basically, that this almost eliminates the problem of food security, bearing in mind that these technologies also fall in cost exponentially over time. And if we don't need animals, then we don't need the land, we don't need the crops, and we don't need the water to raise them. So could we reforest Borneo? Could we reforest the Amazon, for example? And again, some of the people at the event actually said, well, we've seen this. We've seen some of these different technologies and things. And actually, some of the problems that we have is, what do we do with all the land that we can reclaim? So some of these conversations are actually going on right now with government ministers across Asia. If we can reclaim parts of Malaysia, if we can reclaim different parts of our continent that used to be given over to food production, what do we do with the land? When we have a look at crops, there are three kinds of crops: tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Tier 3 crops are kind of your lettuces and everything else. Tier 2 crops are things like your tomatoes, and your sort of different sort of vegetables and bits and bobs. And Tier 3 crops, or Tier 1 crops, basically are staples. Rice, wheat, so on and so forth. Now, when we have a look at growing crops in vertical farms, firstly, you can grow crops with 8 times the yield. The yield is guaranteed. Generally, they take up 350 times, not percent, 350 times less space. If you pump carbon dioxide into these vertical farms, which essentially makes the plants carbon neutral, carbon negative, then the yields increase by 30%. But you don't need to use herbicides or pesticides. When you have a look at water, vertical farms today are so efficient that they can use up to 98% less potable water. But if you extract water from the air, like we do with dehumidifiers, for example, condensing technology, you can extract all of the water that you need for the vertical farm from the air, not from the ground. So going back to the state of California, now you can't grow almonds basically in a vertical farm yet, and so on and so forth. You can grow rice though in Singapore. What would happen if all of a sudden I could extract water from the air and then I wasn't actually fighting with humans as a farmer for water from the Colorado River? It might not solve the problem, but it certainly starts easing some of the problems. Bearing in mind that from an investment perspective, we actually need the capital to build the vertical farms in the first place. And that's an investment issue. But when we have a look at vertical farms, they can be fully automated, like we see with Ox Robotics and so on and so forth, which then again means that we have organic produce whose supply is guaranteed, that is grown round the corner, whose cost drops exponentially. This is a roboticized vertical farm. There are no fields, yet it's guaranteed food security. These crops are not destroyed by drought, pests, or anything else. Jeff Bezos has invested $250 million in that company and is looking to put vertical farms in most Amazon warehouses. Different conversation. Now, what about this? What about being able to produce food from air? So protein and soy ingredients from air. This is a Mars NASA technology. By taking carbon dioxide, electricity, and microbes, we can actually produce soy and protein that can be used as a meat substitute from literally the air. And this company is Solar Foods. I think air is fairly abundant.
As protein has become an urgent issue from a sustainability point of view, new protein sources are simultaneously becoming more important. At Solar Foods, we are bringing a truly sustainable protein to the market that is completely free from the environmental burdens of agriculture. The next big thing within protein production is definitely cellular farming, which is also referred to as cellular agriculture. It relies on cultivation of cells under controlled conditions for the industrial production of food instead of relying on conventional agriculture or animal husbandry. It can be growing tissue cells and producing meat without the cow, or harnessing, for example, yeast cells and making eggs without chickens, or growing single-cell organisms and producing high-protein food ingredients, which is what we are currently working on at Solar Foods. Solein is a single-cell protein. The uniqueness of those cells is that they are grown on air and electricity as the main feedstocks. What we have in the end is a yellow powder rich in protein and ready to be formulated into food products. My work focuses on the development part of solein as a food ingredient and understanding its technological and nutritional properties. When working with a completely new kind of food ingredient, the most important thing first is to ensure safety, followed by nutritional value and the other functional food properties. Proteins are essential macromolecules for our body. They are the building blocks of our muscles. But proteins also play a significant role in food formulations. They are structural building blocks of certain food products, such as cheese, a dairy yogurt, white bread, plant-based meat alternatives, and many other food products are stabilized by proteins. If you look at the products from bakery, dairy, ready-to-eat meals, even the dried soups, they all contain protein. It is a fact that conventional food production, which heavily relies on agriculture and industrial animal farming, constitutes a major threat to environmental stability. Fortunately, technological innovations, one being solein, have made it possible to utilize the diversity of nature and produce an infinite and nutritious food supply. In our opinion, solein and other cellular agriculture concepts offer humanity the prospect of being able to practice agriculture sustainably for many more generations to come.
So the ability to sustainably produce an infinite amount of protein at costs that today are commercially competitive with traditional soya and protein manufacture, and which will only, because this is an industrialized process, go down. We also have 3D and 4D printed food. Now, when we have a look at 3D printed food, we have organizations like Nestle as well as Otsuka out of Japan that increasingly, and Sushi Singularity, that can take your DNA and end up 3D printing personalized food for you based on what your body needs, or what they think your body needs based on your genomic makeup and so on and so forth, and your biochemistry, etc., etc., etc. But when we talk about 3D and 4D printing food, like these sort of these fruits here, are these fruits or are they something completely new? So technology is helping us literally reinvent food from the cell up and the culture out. However, while we have many, many different solutions, all with varying degrees of success, when we have a look at trying to feed an increasingly large global population that is increasingly hungry for high quality food at affordable prices, that is hopefully grown in a sustainable way or produced in a sustainable way, we can't ignore the fact that changing the system, moving from one way of producing food to another at a local, a regional, national, or even international level is easy. Change is hard. And irrespective of the industry that you're in, how many incumbents have ever changed their own industry? The status quo generally never changes the status quo. Why? Because the status quo is familiar. When we have a look at incumbents, incumbents were built around producing this product. They have scaled efficiency within their organizations around this product. And if we're moving to a new product, a new way of doing things, this starts having to get dismantled. And we have to spend money and introduce extra risk into our operating and business models and strategies to move to this. So as humans and executives, we like the status quo because we know it. It's comfortable. It's what we're used to. But if at the start of the presentation you think that today's food production system is fine stick with the status quo. If you think it is breaking or broken, then the status quo needs to change. And there are companies that are trying to change the status quo. But the incumbents aren't happy about it. And there's a variety of different reasons why the incumbents, whether they're institutions, whether they're different populations, whether they're different companies, aren't happy about it. Because as a startup, some of the startups that I've shown you, and there are lots more, you disrupted their market. You disrupted their companies. You disrupted their jobs and their livelihoods. And let's be honest, no one likes this. You wouldn't like this happening to you. And so the natural thing that we do is this flight or fight response kicks in. And as a result, we try to beat you down. So the way that incumbents typically try to slow the growth or even kill the growth of startups in any sector, it's not just the food sector, it's the transportation sector, the energy sector, we've seen it with the oil and gas giants and so on and so forth, is the first thing they will do basically is they will try to discredit what you are doing and you as a company or you as individuals. They will try to put you out of business. They will tell you it won't work. It's a stupid idea growing burgers from the cells of animals rather than actually having the cow itself. They will try to slow you down. They will slow you down by throwing litigation sue balls at you left, right, and center. And while they're doing all this, in the back of their heads, they're trying to figure out if all of this fails and it doesn't put you out of business, then do we partner or buy? And as a lot of these food startups actually grow, companies that have tried to put them out of business have failed, and increasingly some of the incumbents are now partnering. Some of them are actually buying them. So that's kind of the last resort from an incumbent's perspective. And this is how they are going to try to discredit your companies. They will try to turn consumer opinion, marketing, and regulations and law against you. When we look at consumer opinion, they will tell you that, for example, if we look at meat, the meat that is produced in the lab rather than from an animal is full of toxic chemicals. It's not real meat. It's unsafe. It's killing jobs. If this sounds familiar to you as an entrepreneur, I guarantee you're not just in the agriculture sector. They will turn marketing against you. It doesn't barbecue like real meat. We've actually seen this. These are real examples, by the way. It tastes fake. It's not sustainable. When we have a look at renewable energy transition, go and hunt around on Google. There are plenty of people that say electric vehicles basically don't actually help the planet. They're worse than combustion engine vehicles. That renewable energy is actually really dirty and actually dirtier than gas-powered fire stations or energy plants and so on and so forth. It's not sustainable. It's unethical to produce food in this way. Now, one of the questions I actually got in Malaysia basically was, is meat produced without the animal actually halal? Now, there are a couple of debates around that, but actually when we have a look at the halal lawyers as well as the religious clerics, they're generally edging towards yes, it is. So that's sort of an interesting, when we have a look at a sort of cultural, this from a cultural perspective. And you can't market it as real meat. When we have a look at regulations and law, it's not approved, it's not regulated. Well, if you're in Singapore and the US, I'm sorry, but these things are now regulated and you can buy and you can sell them. It's not safe. You can't label it as real meat. So incumbents, and these, don't just think of these as agriculture specific. This is kind of a playbook that incumbents in every industry use when they face some form of disruption or something that they're uncomfortable about. It's literally a playbook. Now, an example of this sort of came to head in 2019, basically when the US cattle ranchers actually took people who were producing cultivated meat in the lab and who were then calling it real meat to court. Now, as a result of that, because the ranchers didn't want people who were producing lab-made meat to be able to call it real meat, because they were saying, well, it's not from a cow, therefore it's not real, even though it actually is real because it's from the cells from a cow. Confused? You shouldn't be. Now, the Senate actually passed this, the HR 4881 Act. And they said meat made from cells cannot be called meat. It must be called cultivated meat. The ranchers won. But when we actually have a look at the growth of these cultivated meat startups, they're growing fast. Organizations like KFC and McDonald's are actually embracing cultivated meat as part of their future food programs for a variety of different reasons. It's sustainable. In McDonald's case, McDonald's keeps getting beaten around the head basically for contributing to the deforestation of the Amazon rainforest. But if McDonald's made the meat next door in a lab and then stuck it into a burger, that activism goes away, or at least it goes somewhere else. Generally, it goes somewhere else. So there are advantages for different organizations across the board when we start looking at this. But frankly, a lot of consumers don't really care, because if we have a look at the way that we're producing meat today, it's generally unsustainable. Run the numbers. If you're emotional about it, figure that out. If you are logical about it, you can see it doesn't really make sense. A lot of my friends are farmers, and when you start putting different statistics and everything else in front of them, you can see them grudgingly actually sort of coming round. This transition isn't easy, but the point of this presentation is to show you that we do have solutions to the world's food and production problems. But while we have ranchers in the US that are saying meat that is made from the cell of an animal and then produced in a lab is not real meat, this isn't new news. Because did you know in the 1900s, when people started producing ice from freezers, the people who were taking ice out of rivers and sourcing ice from glaciers and icebergs and all these other places they were actually getting ice from and putting them in their chilled ships, went to governments and said, you cannot call ice that is made in a freezer ice. You have to call it artificial ice. Now, how many of you actually use natural ice in your cocktails or in your drinks or in your smoothies? None of you, let's face it. You all use artificial ice. And yet, at some point in the 19th century, we had to move from the principle and the idea of using natural ice harvested from rivers or wherever it happened to be, and making ice in this thing called a freezer. And what's the status quo now? Ice made from a freezer, or ice from a glacier, or ice from an iceberg, or ice from a frozen lake? You know the answer. So when we have a look at the status quo, sometimes there's reasons to change the status quo. Some people are for it, some people are against it. But overall, when we actually have a look at the problems that we have when we are faced with the future of food production for a growing population, for a planet that is increasingly environmentally ravaged, we have solutions, but now we need to scale them and use them and enact a major culture change. And in Malaysia, as well as in other countries, Singapore, China, US to a degree, the UK, there are many, many people who are now pushing these changes through. Because at a very high level, some of these, arguably all of these, just make sense. So thank you for watching or even re-watching the presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Good, bad, other, for, against, why would this work? Why wouldn't it work? I'm always happy to be critiqued and everything else. I'm always happy to see other people's points of view. Keep an open mind. That's it. But thank you again, and take care and have a great future and stay well fed. Ta-da. Bye-bye.